Today's lesson is about gas transport in blood. Specifically, we're looking at carbon dioxide and oxygen being transported in the blood. Okay, and we need to think about hemoglobin. As hemoglobin is the protein in the blood that helps carry gases. Okay, so that helps to transport. And when we're thinking about it, hemoglobin primarily carries oxygen. Okay, so the oxygen, when it enters the blood, usually gets transported as a context with hemoglobin. Okay, and carbon dioxide when it enters the blood, okay, when we're talking carbon dioxide and entering the blood, it can transport three different ways, okay? Approximately 7%, we'll say we can round up to 10%, is dissolved in the blood, okay? About 20% is carried by the specialized hemoglobin. And when it's being carried, it's carbamino hemoglobin. Okay, but the majority of it, or say about 70%, I'm just rounding up here, is carried not as carbon dioxide, but as bicarbonate ion in the blood. Okay, and we're going to start with a chemical reaction to sort of explain that. So I'm going to go to a new sheet. Oh, sorry, went too far. And the reaction you get is when carbon dioxide enters into water, okay, it basically reacts with water and it creates H2CO3, okay, which is carbonic acid. And that's sort of an, we'll say unstable for the lack of a better word. And it actually dissociates down into its proton, or the H plus ion, and the bicarbonate ion. Okay? And this basically is the acid ion. Okay? So this is facilitated by an enzyme, okay? Carbonic anhydrase. Okay? And carbonic anhydrase facilitates this so it happens much more quickly. And so when you think of it, if you look at these, this reaction is a equilibrium. So if more and more CO2 is being added, the reaction is going to head in that direction and create more acid and bicarbonate. Okay? So if you think of it in the tissues, as CO2 is coming in, it's going to be pushing this reaction towards the H plus and the HCO3. As you'll see later, if there's more and more H plus ions in this environment, it's going to push it this way, which is heading back towards creating CO2 molecules, okay? So hopefully this will be clear when we get to different parts of the body. And remember, you've got the lungs, you've got the heart, and then you have the body, okay? And when we're showing blood flow, it goes from the lungs to the heart, from the heart to the body. And then from the body, it goes there to the heart and back to the lungs, okay? So remember, it's a one-way system from the circulatory system, and that's what happens. So in the lungs, you have basically oxygen going in and carbon dioxide going out. And in the tissues, you will have oxygen going out into the tissues and CO2 entering the blood system, okay? So that should be, that's sort of grade 10 review. Equation, if you go back to that equation and we look at the H pluses, if that starts to grow, we're going to go in the other direction. Let's take a look at the tissues, okay? So if we're looking at tissues here, okay, so this is the body tissues. And in the cells, so the cells will do it with black. Okay, so we've got cell respiration taking place. We have oxygen going in, mixing with some glucose, making carbon dioxide, making water, and making that ATP energy, sorry, ATP. Okay, so you need oxygen coming in and you need CO2 going out because that is the negative side of things. And here we have the blood flowing. So we're going to put blood flow in this direction. So it's coming in here. What's happening is it needs oxygen. And what it's doing is there's CO2 being produced. So there's CO2 coming out. So we have the CO2 that's entering here. Okay, and then what we have is we have what's called oxyhemoglobin coming in. So we have hemoglobin with oxygen attached. Okay, and as it's entering, there's not the CO2 that's coming in is reacting with the water. And so as the CO2 is going in, remember CO2 has been reacting with water and it's producing, I'm just skipping the intermediary, the acid and the bicarbonate, and the extra H pluses in here, okay, create an environment for hemoglobin not to carry oxygen, so it actually releases the oxygen, and the oxygen will leave and enter into the cells just through basically diffusion, because there's lots of oxygen outside now and there's not much in here because we're using it. So the level of oxygen here is going down. And what hemoglobin is, so this is oxyhemoglobin right there, okay? There's a point where hemoglobin's not carrying anything, kind of sad, and so it's going to start picking up the H+. So hemoglobin, as it's leaving, has now been picking up the proton, and if it's picking up the proton, then the blood is no longer becoming acidic because the H pluses are hiding, and there's no more CO2, and so as it's leaving, this, we'll call it reduced hemoglobin, is now filling the blood. Okay, so as it comes in, you had oxyhemoglobin over here, it dropped off its oxygen, CO2 was going into the blood, reacting with water to create H plus and bicarbonate ions. The H plus is now picked up by the hemoglobin and it's now leaving basically as an attached. So pH is not altered. So hemoglobin is buffering the blood. So it's buffering the pH of the blood. By taking in the H plus, which is your acid, okay? So in the body tissues, that's what happens. Let's shift over to the lungs. Okay, and so when we get to the lungs, again, here's your alveolar tissue. The capillaries are coming in. Okay, and on this side, you have hemoglobin with H plus. Okay, so you've got lots of reduced hemoglobin. Okay, and it's coming in. Outside, you've got lots of oxygen in the alveolar tissue, but there's not a lot of CO2, so the oxygen is coming in. And what it's doing is the hemoglobin is now releasing the H pluses into the blood. The hemoglobin is picking up the oxygen and becoming oxyhemoglobin as it leaves the alveolar tissue. Okay? And what's happening here is now that the H plus ions are increasing in the blood, so if you think about there's more and more acid, well, if you go back to that, and so what happens is the H pluses start to react with the bicarbonates, which then force it to the H2CO3, which then continue to produce CO2 and water. Okay, so the reaction is going in this direction now because these are growing. Okay, and what happens is now with the H pluses coming off, mixing with HCO3 minus, you're actually making CO2, and the CO2 starts to leave. Okay, and so as the blood is now leaving here, you have very high levels of oxyhemoglobin. Whereas previous, you had very high levels of hemoglobin carrying acid or reduced hemoglobin, and now when it's leaving, it's oxyhemoglobin. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense about how blood gases are transported. Again, you can always ask me questions in class, or you can contact me by email. Thank you so much. Have a great day.